and welcome to the Secure Payments Task Force, Card Signature, Card PIN, and Card Not Present Payment Use Cases Industry Feedback Opportunity. Our presenters today are Dorothy Anderson and Ed O'Neill. I will turn the call over to Dorothy.
Great. Thank you, Meredith. Good afternoon. I'm Dorothy Anderson from the Industry Relations team from the Federal Reserve System. Before we get into our topic today around the payment use cases, I'm going to provide you a little bit of a background regarding the Federal Reserve's efforts to improve the U.S. payment system. I also want to make sure I note that in that materials button that Meredith just mentioned, you can also find copies of these payment use cases. So if you want, feel free to pull those up and reference them as we talk about them later in our discussion. All right, moving on to slide 3, Meredith. In January 2015, the Federal Reserve released strategies for improving the U.S. payment system, an ambitious multi-year plan that focuses on improving the speed, efficiency, and security of the U.S. payment system from end to end. Since the release of this multi-year plan, the Fed has worked with payment stakeholders to execute the strategies outlined in the paper. The goal is to enhance the U.S. payment system to meet the changing demands of both American consumers and businesses. Strategies for improving the U.S. payment system communicates desired outcomes for the payment system and outlines the strategies and tactics the Federal Reserve will pursue in collaboration with stakeholders to help the country achieve these outcomes. The paper outlines the Federal Reserve's intent to establish a task force to identify effective approaches for implementing safe and faster payment capabilities with a focus on ubiquity. The paper also calls for a task force to advise the Fed on reducing payment fraud and advancing the safety, security, and resiliency of the payment system. That is the work of the Secure Payments Task Force, and you'll learn more about their work in just a few minutes. Additionally, the Federal Reserve will pursue efforts to enhance payment system efficiency through the work on standards, directories, and business-to-business payment improvements, alongside efforts to enhance Fed-provided services for same-day ACH, risk management, and settlement. Today, we will focus our presentation on efforts related to the security strategy that is highlighted here. This is just a high-level overview of these strategies. I would like to note that you can find more details on our website, fedpaymentsimprovement.org. Moving on to the next slide, slide 4. Here we highlight the mission and the objectives of the Secure Payments Task Force. The task force was established in June 2015 and outlined the following objectives. 1, advise the Fed on payment security matters. 2, coordinate with the Faster Payments Task Force. That's the task force I mentioned a few minutes ago. And 3, determine areas of focus and priorities for action. The task force has identified and collectively agreed on the top payment security issues facing the industry and has framed the structure and processes to address them. In addition, the task force is providing advice to the Fed regarding opportunities to enhance payment system security. This includes ways to improve publicly available fraud data, the development and adoption of payment security standards, as well as related industry education and outreach. Moving on to slide 5, this highlights some of these key areas of focus. 1 is payment identity management. These are efforts around the identification and adoption of payment identity management practices to mitigate existing and anticipated fraud vectors. 2, information sharing for the mitigation of payment risk and fraud. The focus here is the availability of payments industry fraud and risk data that can be acted upon by payment industry participants, and also to improve the awareness and implementation of inclusive cybersecurity and fraud information. 3, data protection, the identification and adoption of frameworks for protecting sensitive payment data at rest and in transit. And then finally, 4, the law and regulation coordination. That effort is around identifying opportunities for more consistent interpretation and application of payment laws and regulations to enhance payment system security. Additionally, you'll notice on the bottom there, the task force launched a standards assessment team to work across the efforts to document standards. As I mentioned earlier, there's much more information on these efforts on fedpaymentsimprovement.org, but at a high level, I wanted to give the group an idea of some of the efforts currently for the Secure Payments Task Force. So moving on to slide 6. Today's call is about gathering input from all of you before these payment use cases are finalized for publication. In particular, we would encourage you to think about how you or others in your organization would use them. How do you prefer to access the use cases? Does the level of detail found in the use cases provide appropriate context? Ed O'Neill will go into more detail about these payment use cases, but at a high level, these use cases are intended to provide a common foundation for the payments industry to understand the landscape as it is today and the associated risks. With that, I will pause here and see if I have any questions. Meredith?
Hi, Dorothy. Thank you. And yes, how can I find out who is on the Secure Payments Task Force, and can anyone join the task force?
Thank you. That is a great question. So the rosters for both the Secure and Faster Payments Task Forces are available on fedpaymentsimprovement.org. So you're welcome to go out there and see. We have over 500 organizations and individuals listed on those rosters. And then secondly, yes, you may join the Secure Payments Task Force. On our website, you will also find more information about how to sign up.
Well, thank you very much, Dorothy, and I don't have any other questions at this time.
Great. Thank you, Meredith. So with that, I will turn it over to Ed to pick up on slide 7.
All right. Thank you, Dorothy. And hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us on today's webinar. My name is Ed O'Neill, and I'm an Assistant Vice President with the Federal Reserve, and I work on the Federal Reserve Secure Payments Initiative. I work very closely with the task force members on those areas of focus that Dorothy outlined in her earlier slides here. And I'm excited to have the opportunity to provide an overview of 3 of the payment use cases that have been developed by the Secure Payments Task Force. Before we begin, I wanted to make note of a couple of key items. First, the 3 use cases that we'll be reviewing today are accessible by clicking on the Materials button in the webinar screen. As Dorothy mentioned, you might find these helpful to have these use cases handy and in front of you as we walk through the subsequent slides, as those documents contain additional details in addition to what will be provided on the slides. Second, we'll be asking a few polling questions via the webinar screen specific to each of these use cases. This is an opportunity for you to provide feedback to the task force on these use cases that they will use as they look to finalize these documents. And we encourage you to provide your input when those polls are presented, as this information will prove very valuable to the task force as part of their input process. All right, before we begin diving deep into each of the use cases themselves, we'd like to begin by providing an overview of the payment use case template before we dive into each of the specific use cases. So if we can turn to the next slide. We want to orient the group here today as well to talk a little bit about the value that we believe that these use cases will provide to the industry. So the task force, as they were developing these use cases, considered the value, looked at the potential target audiences for these use cases, and also how those audiences may utilize the use cases in their daily activities. If you take a look at the top of the slide here, we look at the potential target audiences that have been identified by the task force. And those include groups such as bank operations, fraud mitigation groups, auditors, both internally and externally, product development teams, technology solution providers and processors, as well as other types of departments, including risk and compliance officers. In terms of how these groups may use these use cases, I think first and foremost, the task force views these use cases as a tool to educate or train payment and security practitioners. I know from a personal perspective, these use cases would have been very helpful to me in prior roles when I started to learn more about a specific payment use case or started to also become proficient in the security of those payment types. These use cases might also aid in decision-making or product development and implementations. So as your product development groups or other areas within your organization might look at product development, these use cases may be helpful in understanding how payments work, how data flows from an end-to-end process perspective, and the risks associated with that data. Overall, these use cases also provide an end-to-end view into the payment flow. So they identify how a payment begins all the way from an enrollment through the transaction process all the way through to settlement and reconciliation. And along that journey identifies the risks and propose mitigating controls that can be leveraged to secure that payment from an end-to-end perspective. If we could turn to slide 9, I want to walk through just as before we go through each of the use cases, provide a quick overview of the document itself and the structure behind the use case template. So you have the use cases. If you have the use cases handy in front of you, you'll see that they are broken out into 5 specific sections. The first section, or the blue section, is titled the Payment Flow Overview. Within this section, there's a definition of the payment type. And this section also lays out the various functions from an end-to-end process perspective. And you'll note that this is consistent. This is the one section in the document that is consistent throughout all 8 payment use cases. The second section, or the payment type operation, is the green section. And this lays out potential scenarios within a payment use case and identifies parts of that flow within that use case where there may be differences among those scenarios. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we dive into the next sections. The third section is an overview of the security methods and associated risks. The intent of this section is for the task force to outline existing security methods that pertain to these payment use cases, as well as some of the general risks associated with the payment itself. The fourth section outlines an inventory of sensitive payment data and the risks associated with that data. So this task force has identified the sensitive payment data as those data elements that need to be protected throughout the payment, and also outlined the risks associated with if that data were to be compromised. This also outlines how that data might be used if it were exposed to commit fraud. And the fifth section, or last section, is titled the Overview of Standards. But it's important to note that not only are the open and proprietary standards that pertain to this use case listed here, but there's also a section for rules, regulations, and also gaps and issues that have been identified by the task force from a standards perspective. So before we dive in, let me just pause and ask if there's any questions.
I just want to remind everyone that you can ask questions at any time by hitting the Ask Questions button at the bottom of your screen. And looking right now, it doesn't look like we have any questions.
Great, thanks, Meredith. So why don't we dive into our first of the 3 use cases for today. And if we turn to slide 10, you'll see that the first use case we're going to go through today is the card signature use case. And if we could turn to slide 11, you'll see again here is where we outline the task force's definition of a card signature payment. So you'll see here that this payment is a payment card funded transaction. So this could be either a credit or a debit card transaction, whereby the cardholder either physically swipes their magnetic stripe of their card or physically dips their EMV chip card at the point of sale terminal and signs the physical or electronic receipt, and that signature that is used as evidence that the cardholder authorized that transaction without necessarily validating the authenticity of that consumer or the signature. If we turn to slide 12, We'll start to walk through some of the highlights as it pertains to the operations of a card signature transaction. You'll note that in this section, the task force identified 3 specific scenarios related to card signature payments: card signature debit, card signature credit, and the last one is card no signature debit. And before we move on, I'll just point out that you'll note that while this is the card signature payment use case, that last one is with no signature is really intended to capture or represent a debit card transaction where no card verification method or no authentication is required. So in this specific scenario, as you'll see as we walk through, a signature or a PIN is not required in this specific instance. It's important to note that operationally these scenarios are very similar in nature, utilizing common access mode and network, a similar format exchange, as well as similar clearing and settlement operations. One difference to note between these different scenarios that have been outlined in the card signature payment type is the funding account for the payment will be different based on whether it's a credit or debit transaction. In the case of a credit transaction, the funding account will be a credit account, and in the case of a debit transaction, the funding account would be the demand deposit account, or the DDA. If we can turn to slide 13, we'll walk through some of the security methods and associated risks specific to the card signature use case. So if you take a look across the top of the slide, you'll see the example security methods. And as we walk through the subsequent slides, you'll also notice that we typically break out each of these sections by enrollment, transaction, and reconciliation. If you look here on the left, the top left of this slide, you'll see from an enrollment perspective, there's some examples of the security methods that are in play today from this payment use case. Things such as know your customer, so identifying, having a customer identification program as well as a know your customer program for validating either a payer or a payee as part of the enrollment. Also things such as background checks and ID verification of a carbon-based life form. Again, authenticating or making sure that you're validating that the individual or organization opening an account is who they say they are. From a transaction perspective, there are various security methods in place today, such as chip, PIN, hardware security modules. Various anomaly and fraud detection methods may be used throughout the transaction process. Employee training is also a key component from a security method perspective, making sure employees that have access to or are part of that payment transaction are properly trained on the security and the risks associated with that payment. Strong key management, in particular in cases where keys are involved. And then from a reconciliation standpoint, anomaly and fraud detection can also be in play here as well. In terms of risks, it's important to point out some of the risks at each of these stages in the transaction process, as well as from an enrollment perspective. Things such as social engineering and account takeovers are key risks to keep in mind at the time of enrollment. From a transaction perspective, again, we're speaking of card signature payments, so the skimming of card data is a risk from a transaction perspective, as well as account takeovers, social engineering, and machine takeover. In the case of machine takeover, an institution or individual may have their machine compromised, and that machine may be used to conduct fraudulent transactions. In the case of reconciliation, from a risk perspective, fraudulent ATM transactions are a risk, and those any transactions could also result in overdraft fees for an account, as well as bounced checks if the account was overdrawn. If we move to slide 14, we'll talk a little bit about the inventory of sensitive payment data and risks associated with that data. Before I do that, I just also want to point out, too, as we're walking through these slides, what you're seeing again on the slides is just an example or a sample that's been pulled from these payment use cases. Again, if you're following along, additional details are included within each of those payment use cases. So as it relates to sensitive payment data from an enrollment perspective, the data that is used to open or enroll account may include name, date of birth, social security number, account numbers, and other data they use, again, to enroll that payee or payor as part of the process to enroll. From a transaction perspective, sensitive payment data may include cardholder data, such as the primary account number or the cardholder's name, sensitive authentication data, which could include full track data or the equivalent on a chip, as well as the security codes printed on the back of cards or encoded on the magnetic stripe. EMV data elements may also be present if this is an EMV transaction. Those data elements may include things such as the application authentication cryptogram, the application transaction counter, and the chip card security codes. From a reconciliation standpoint, some of the sensitive data may include cardholder data that we just covered is also part of the transaction, and also the merchant ID. In terms of the risks associated with that data, from an enrollment perspective, if those data elements that you see above were compromised, those could be used to set up fraudulent accounts. That could include things such as an individual account, credit or debit account, but it also could include things such as a merchant account. And those data elements could also be used to perpetrate additional identity theft crimes. From a transaction perspective, if the cardholder data or the sensitive authentication data were compromised, that information could be used to create counterfeit credit or debit cards. And the compromise of sensitive authorization data could also be used to aid in that process. In the terms of reconciliation, again, if data such as the merchant ID were compromised, there is the possibility of a fraudster spoofing a legitimate merchant and being able to run transactions and bust out an account. There's also the opportunity, if the cardholder data is compromised, again, to create counterfeit cards that could be used for fraudulent transactions. If we turn to the next slide, we'll walk quickly through an overview of the standards. And again, we have, just to orient you on the process here, we have a couple of examples of standards, both open and proprietary standards. We lay out some of the rules as well as some of the regulations that may be applicable to this payment type. So from a standards perspective, you'll see here a number of open standards, which would include the X9.122, secure consumer authentication for internet payments. It's important to note that that standard is currently in draft form, but the task force identified this as a standard that would pertain to this payment type. There's a variety of ISO standards also listed there, as well as the ANSI ASC X9.97 secure cryptographic devices for retail. And from a proprietary standpoint, it's important to point out that there is the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, or the PCI DSS, among other standards listed in that payment use case. From a rules perspective, given this is a credit or debit funded transaction, the payment network rules, so in the case of a credit card, be the network rules of Visa, MasterCard, Discover, American Express, etc. From a debit perspective, that may include some of the debit network's payment rules. And from a regulation perspective, you'll see here Reg E, or the Electronic Funds Transfer Act, FINCen, Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, BSA and AML compliance, as well as we mentioned earlier on in this use case, the Customer Identification Program. So let me pause here and just ask if there's any questions specific to the card signature use case or any other slides that we've covered to date.
Thank you, Ed. And I do have one question. How will these use cases be used by the Secure Payments Task Force?
Sure, that's a fantastic question. So, really these payment use cases serve as a foundational document for a number of other initiatives that the task force is looking at. In particular, looking at this payment use case, it helps identify, again, some of the security methods that are in place today, as well as might help us identify any gaps or issues that exist within a specific payment type. And that information is also being used by the task force as they continue to develop what they've called their payment security framework, which identifies basic principles for managing security of payments, as well as some recommended or some baseline and recommended practices that may apply to payments as a whole.
Thank you very much, Ed, and I don't have any other questions at this time.
All right, thanks, Meredith. I think now is just to get everyone prepared on the phone. If you're following along on the webinar as well, now is the important part where we ask for your valuable feedback. So we are going to ask you a couple of questions related to the card signature payment use case. So if we can queue up the polling, the first polling question you should see available to you on your screen today is, the task force is really interested in your feedback on whether the card signature payment use case would be a useful resource to your organization. And in terms of responses, we're looking for whether or not you strongly agree, you agree, you neither agree or nor disagree, you disagree, or you strongly disagree that the card signature payment use case would be a valuable resource to your organization. We'll give everybody just a couple seconds to log their responses there. All right, and if we could move along to the second question. So again, specific to the card signature payment use case. We also want to ask each of you on the webinar today, the task force is interested in whether you believe the amount of detail that's contained in that card signature use case is appropriate to inform your organization. And again, we're asking whether or not you strongly agree, you neither agree nor disagree, you disagree, or you strongly disagree that the amount of detail in the card signature use case is appropriate to inform your organization. Okay, as we're closing that out, if we can move to slide 18, we'll introduce our next use case. And the next use case we're going to talk through today is the card PIN payment use case. So we just got done walking through the card signature. We're going to turn our attention to card PIN. So we can turn to slide 19. You'll see similar again in format. The task force has created a definition for a card PIN payment use case. In this case, there's quite a bit of detail contained within this definition. So again, this is a payment card funded transaction, credit or debit, whereby the cardholder is physically present but enters a personal identification number at the time of the transaction to authenticate the cardholder to the system and or biometric authentication, which authenticates that cardholder to the device and would include attributes used by the issuer for risk evaluation. Important to note that the cardholder is only granted access if the PIN provided matches the PIN contained in the system and or the biometric authentication of the device, and that PINs are used throughout the industry and include ATM, point of sale, mobile wallets, and e-commerce transactions. It's also important to note that a PIN may also be used to complete a debit transaction where the magnetic stripe of the card is swiped at the point of sale, or even on an EMV chip card transaction where the chip card is dipped at the point of sale and a PIN replaces the cardholder's signature to authorize that transaction. If we move to slide 20, again, we'll start off by walking through the operations associated with a card PIN payment. Somewhat similar to the card signature payment type, you'll see that there are two scenarios identified by the task force specific to card PIN transactions, being the credit and the debit scenarios. As we noted in the prior use case as well, operationally you'll see that these scenarios are very similar, again, using very similar enrollment processes. The transaction process is generally the same as well, with a few exceptions. And the same with the clearing, settlement, and the reconciliation processes. It is important, again, to point out that the one main difference in this payment type scenario is the funding account for the payment. So again, in the case of a credit transaction, the funding account is the credit account and the demand deposit account is the funding account for a debit transaction. If we turn to slide 21, we'll walk briefly through the security methods and associated risks of the card PIN payment. So again, similar as we noted, the enrollment processes are very similar to what we walked through in card signature. So you'll see here security methods include know your customer, customer identification program, also employee training. From a transaction perspective, it's important to note that the chip PIN, the hardware security module, must be managed according to specific standards. So there are standards out there for properly securing these transactions in the case of a card PIN use case, hardware security module being an important aspect of that as well. Similar to the other transactions that we walked through, is anomaly and fraud detection may be present at various points in the transaction process. So it's important to note that some anomaly and fraud detection may take place at the initiation of the transaction. Some may take place as the transaction is completing. From a reconciliation standpoint, again, anomaly and fraud detection components are also important security methods that are in place today in this transaction type. In terms of risks, so again, similar to what we walked through in the prior use case, social engineering and account takeover are very important risks that need to be addressed at the time of enrollment. In the terms of the time of transaction, account takeover and social engineering, as well as the machine takeover risks that we discussed in the prior use case. From a reconciliation standpoint, again, definitely in the case of a debit transaction, draining the demand deposit account could result in additional risks, as well as the risk of fraudulent transactions taking place. If we turn to slide 22, we'll walk through an inventory of sensitive data and the associated risks pertaining to the card PIN use case. So we'll start off looking at the enrollment piece. Again, same type of data used for enrollments being the name, date of birth, address, social security number, and account number. Tax identification numbers may also be used to enroll or open a merchant account. And from the transaction perspective, again, the same data elements would apply that we talked about before. Cardholder data being the primary account number, the cardholder name. The sensitive authentication data being the magnetic stripe data or the chip equivalent, they're the equivalent of the mag stripe that's encoded on the chip. One important point to note in terms of sensitive authentication data, given this is a PIN transaction, is that another component of sensitive authentication data would include the PIN or the PIN offsets that are part of that transaction. You also have the EMV data elements that we discussed before, things such as the application counter, as well as some other related elements specific to EMV transactions. In terms of the risks associated with that data, if it were to be compromised, again, being able to fraudulently set up an account or take over an account is a risk of if the enrollment data was compromised or exposed. And from a transaction perspective, it's also important to point out that that cardholder data could be used by a criminal to create fake credit or debit accounts for keyed card-present transactions. They could also be used to create to perpetrate card-not-present fraud transactions at merchants that might not validate specific security codes, such as the CID. And if that compromised cardholder data was, if sensitive authentication data was also compromised in conjunction with that cardholder data, those could be used in conjunction to create counterfeit credit and debit cards that could be used as if they were the actual cardholder. If we move to slide 23, spend a little bit of time here again talking through some of the standards that apply, as well as the rules and the regulations. So again, these are just a snapshot and an example of the standards, rules, and regulations that are included in this use case. I'd again turn your attention to the use case in particular, the specific use case document that contains a number of other open and proprietary standards, as well as some additional regulations. So in the case of standards, the ANSI X9.8-1, the Personal Identification Management and Security Standard, ISO 9564, the Banking Personal Identification Number Package. So again, speaking definitely to the specifics of a PIN transaction in these cases from an open standards perspective. And from a proprietary standard, again, the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard is also something that would apply to this transaction type. Similar to the card signature transaction, the payment network rules, so in the case of credit, it would be the Visa, MasterCard, American Express, and Discover rules may apply, as well as in the case of a debit transaction, you would see the debit network transaction, or debit network's rules apply to that transaction. Similarly, in terms of regulations, you have the Electronic Funds Transfer Act, or Regulation E. And also introducing the fact that because we do have debit involved here, you'll also see Regulation II, or the Dodd-Frank Act, also known as the Durbin Amendment, which would apply to these transactions. So let me pause there as we've completed the walkthrough of the card PIN payment use case and see if there's any questions.
Thank you, Ed, and I do want to remind everyone that you can ask questions by selecting that Ask a Question button at the bottom of your screen. And I do have one question for you. Are there any safeguards being considered to keep fraudulent transactions from taking place?
Another great question, and I think the short answer is yes. I think what you'll see here, again, as we mentioned in the past too, is the payment use cases are really intended to, again, outline the life cycle of a payment from end to end. It does identify some of those security methods that could be used today to keep fraudulent transactions from taking place. So one example of that might be the anomaly and fraud detection. So there are different solutions or technologies that can be put in place, or processes even that can be put in place to monitor and review transactions to keep fraudulent, or to kind of monitor, alert, or block transactions from taking place. And that's the intent of calling out the anomaly and fraud detection pieces. And again, I'd also point out that these documents serve as the baseline or the starting point for the task force as they continue to develop additional security practices, whether they be baseline security practices or recommended security practices for the industry as it pertains to further securing payments with the goal of again keeping those fraudulent transactions from taking place in the first place. It's a great question.
Thank you very much, Ed, and I am checking to see if we have any other questions, and it doesn't look like that at this time.
All right, so I just ask everybody to get prepped again for our polling, and I just want to remind you too as well, if you have any questions, feel free to submit those via the Ask Question button on the webinar tool. But as we turn our attention to the next set of polling questions, you'll see we're going to ask very similar questions to what we asked before. And again, I just want to encourage you to participate in these polls, as again, this feedback is very useful to the task force in finalizing these use case documents. So the first question we're going to ask is, again, the task force wants to know from each of you whether you believe the card PIN payment use case would be a valuable resource or useful resource to your organization. And again, we're asking if you strongly agree with that statement, you agree, you neither agree nor disagree, you disagree, or you strongly disagree that the card PIN payment use case would be a useful resource to your organization. Okay, and if we turn to the next question, similar to what we walked through before as well, so the task force not only interested in the usefulness of the use case template itself, but also want to make sure that the level of detail that's contained in the card PIN use case is appropriate to help inform your organization. So again, we ask if you strongly agree, you agree, either disagree or agree, disagree, or strongly disagree that the amount of detail contained within the card PIN payment use case is appropriate to help inform your organization. Okay. If we can turn next to slide 26, I'm going to walk through the last of our 3 payment use cases for this afternoon, and that's the card not present payment use case. So we did spend a little bit of time on the prior 2 walking through what a card present payment use case might look like from both a signature and a PIN perspective. Now we're going to turn our attention to the task force's definition of in the use case template associated with card not present transactions. We can turn to slide 27. We'll start off with the definition the task force has developed for a card not present payment. So again, similar to the other 2, this is a payment card funded transaction. Again, it's a credit or debit account that's funding this transaction, where the cardholder does not physically present the card or is not physically present at the time of the transaction for a merchant's physical examination, and that at the time that the order is given and the payment is effected. So again, the card is not present at the time of the transaction. Just some different additional details related to this type of payment. So this transaction may involve the cardholder typing his or her name, as well as their associated card details, which would include the account number, which could be their account number from their payment card itself, or it could be a one-time virtual use card number. It could be a tokenized card payment transaction as well. They also include their billing and shipping address, their card verification code. This may also be affected by biometrics, as well as additional authentication methods such as a PIN. And the expiration date would also be entered into a payment access device. Those payment access devices could include things such as a mobile-based payment access device, or an internet browser, a mobile browser, or a mobile application. Or they could also provide some portions of those card details and personal details over the phone as part of a mail order or telephone order transaction to complete the purchase. We turn to slide 28. We will walk a little bit through the highlights of the card not present payment type operations. Again, it should be no surprise what the scenario is broken out into two pieces. So we have a credit and debit scenario outlined by the task force for the card not present use case. Again, because this is a payment card funded transaction, you'll see again that the enrollment aspects, the format exchange, much of the transaction process itself, all the way through clearing and settlement and reconciliation are operationally the same for a card not present credit or debit transaction. In terms of key differences, some things to point out. In the access mode and network section, you'll also note that in the debit scenario, the access mode may include a cardless ATM transaction initiated on a mobile device. So this is something that would be specific more to that debit scenario in this case, and not applicable to the credit scenario. You also again see that the funding account is different, as we've talked about in the prior two use cases, whether it's a credit account or a demand deposit account that funds that transaction. If we turn to slide 29, and we'll take a look at some of the example of the security methods that are in place today, as well as the risks associated with a card not present transaction. As we mentioned before, the enrollment is going to be very similar, if not identical, to what we talked about in the prior two use cases. So again, the same security methods would apply here, for whether it's employee training, other programs such as customer identification program and know your customer. From a transaction perspective, with the card not being present in this transaction, there may be different security methods deployed. So things such as a Mod 10 check and pre-authorization fraud prevention services may be leveraged by various parties of the payment to verify the card details that were entered into either the mobile browser or the other access device were legitimate. There's also, again, anomaly and fraud detection tools and resources that can be deployed by various parties to the transaction throughout that end-to-end transaction process. From a risk perspective, again, from an enrollment perspective, there is the risk of social engineering and account takeover. Those are common, again, across the enrollment process of the payment. From a transaction perspective, again, you also have the account takeover risk and transactions being perpetrated using someone else's account. And you also have the possibility the transaction data may be altered or spoofed. So again, these are card not present transactions, and transaction data may be altered or spoofed at the time that it's entered as part of to initiate that payment. If we turn to slide 30, we'll also take a quick look at the various sensitive payment data elements that are included in this transaction and the risks associated with that. From an enrollment perspective, again, it's identical to what we talked about in the prior two use cases. You'll see that name, date of birth, address, social security number, etc. are used as part of opening either a payee or a payer or payee account. Transaction perspective, you will note here that we have cardholder data and sensitive authentication data present as part of this transaction. So again, cardholder data would include things such as the primary account number, the cardholder name, expiration date. Sensitive authentication data would include things, in this case, given this is a card not present transaction, things such as the security code, otherwise known as CID or CVV2, that's printed on the back of the card and also entered in as part of the transaction process. From a reconciliation perspective, again, the merchant ID and the cardholder data are key components of the sensitive data that's included in that process. And from a risk perspective, if the enrollment data were to be compromised or exposed, again, there's opportunity for fraudsters to fraudulently set up accounts or take over accounts and perpetrate fraud in that manner. Also, other identity theft crimes could be leveraged using that data. From a transaction perspective, again, it's very similar to what we talked about before. In this case, if the sensitive authentication data and the cardholder data were exposed, they could be used to create fraudulent transactions on other e-commerce or card-not-present merchants. We turn to slide 31. We'll walk through, again, a brief example of some of the standards and rules and regulations applicable to the card-not-present payment. In open standards perspective, you have ANSI X9.112, the secure customer authentication for internet payments. So again, we're talking about card-not-present payments, so this would be applicable here. ANSI X9-112-3, the mobile banking and payments. This is another example of a standard that is currently in draft, but the task force did want to call out here is specific to this payment use case. And I think, as we also talked about before too, the ISO 812 core banking technical specification is also another example of a standard that is in draft, but is also applicable to this payment use case. From a proprietary perspective, again, noting that we are talking about payment card funded transactions, the payment card industry data security standard would also apply among other proprietary standards. Similar to the other two use cases, again, given this is a credit or debit funded transaction, the payment network rules would apply to this transaction. And similarly, the regulations that we talked about before would also apply. So Reg E, Reg Z, the Truth in Lending and Card Act, as well as Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, or the CFPB regulations may also apply to these transactions. So let me pause for a minute as we've concluded kind of each of our three use cases, and let me see if there's any questions from the webinar or the phone participants.
Thank you, Ed. And I do just want to remind everyone, again, you can ask your questions by selecting the Ask Questions button. We did get one in, so does the task force plan to do any additional use case templates?
Another great question. So I think if you've participated in the additional webinars or if you've gone out to fedpaymentsimprovement.org, you'll note that the task force has created 8 initial use case templates. So I won't walk through each of them because I'll probably miss 1 or 2, but there are 8 payment use cases that have been identified. We walked through 3 of those today. Those are the initial scope of the work that the task force has undertaken. There have been other use cases that have been discussed at the task force level, and the task force is determining whether or not to move forward with those as a later part of their efforts. But for now, the initial focus is on those 8 use cases that you'll see populated on fedpaymentsimprovement.org.
Thank you very much, Ed. And I'm checking here again, and it doesn't look like we've received any other questions.
All right, perfect. So this is, again, your last opportunity as it relates to these use cases to provide your feedback. So we're going to open up the polling specific to card-not-present payment use cases. And again, you'll see the same 2 questions that we've asked on the other use cases here as well. So the task force is interested, from your perspective, will the card-not-present payment use case be a useful resource to your organization? Again, you'll see the array of responses here from strongly agree all the way through strongly disagree. And we ask for your input on whether or not the card-not-present use case would be a valuable resource to your organization. Okay, and then the last polling question that we'll ask, pertaining again to the card-not-present use case, is the task force is again interested in the amount of detail that's contained within the card-not-present use case appropriate to help inform your organization. And again, I'll let you look through here, and we're interested in your response. That could range from strongly agree, neither agree nor disagree, all the way through strongly disagree. Again, ask for your input there on whether or not the amount of detail contained in the card not present use case is appropriate to help inform your organization. All right, let me just pause one more time and just see if there's any additional questions.
Ed, I am taking a look, and it doesn't look like we have anything else coming in right now.
All right, thanks, Meredith. So why don't I thank everybody for your participation on the webinar. I'm going to turn it over to Dorothy, and she's going to walk through some of the next steps on next steps related to the feedback provided on the payment use cases. So Dorothy, let me turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Ed. So don't put away those polling fingers just yet. We've got one more question to throw at you. So if we can move on to slide 35. Our last polling question for this webinar relates to the format of the use cases. So in what formats or methods would you like to access the material? A search and filter online. B, an infographic. C, print. Or D, some other type of format. This will help the task force determine what's the best ways that various segments throughout the payments industry would like to access these payment use cases. So I'll give everybody a few seconds to answer that final remaining polling question. And again, to reiterate what Ed said, we really appreciate your feedback here. This is going to be very helpful for the Secure Payments Task Force to take back this feedback and use it as they finalize these deliverables. So moving on to slide 36. Based on the input provided through these feedback opportunities, the information will be shared with the task force, and then we'll help them prepare them for delivery, which we expect to be in late third quarter of this year. Moving on to slide 37, there's a couple of additional opportunities you have to provide input. This is our last and final webinar in these series. And we also wanted to remind everyone that you do, if you're interested, you do have the opportunity in joining the Secure Payments Task Force and some of the work groups that I mentioned earlier on this call. You can find more information on your website. If you're not interested in joining the task force, you can always sign up for our community on fedpaymentsimprovement.org. That's a great way to stay up to date on these efforts and get alerts when new information becomes available. All right. Before we close this afternoon, I will take one more pause and ask Meredith if we have any questions.
Thank you, Dorothy. And I did actually get a question for you. Where can I find the use cases?
Great. Thank you for that question. So as we mentioned earlier, they were provided within this webinar under the materials link. But as Ed mentioned, there's more than just the 3 use cases we went over today, and you can find all of those use cases on fedpaymentsimprovement.org under the section for payment security. Any other questions, Meredith?
I am not seeing any more at this time.
Okay, great. Well, on behalf of the Secure Payments Task Force, the Federal Reserve, and Ed O'Neill and myself, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. We hope you have a great day.